You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Hello and welcome to another fine hour of the Hoosier Humanist Hour. With me, my name is V. Today with me we have Caleb and our sound engineer Andrew. As usual, the show is put together by the members of FreeThought Fort Wayne, a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Our contact info, fortwayneaha@gmail.com. Phone number is 260-376-2268. And probably our best place for contact is facebook.com/FreeThoughtFW. Just a couple of small announcements before we begin the discussion for today. We've recently elected an entire new board of directors, so congrats to us. Hopefully the new board is going to continue, with the great events and all the things that we've been doing as a group, and we'll move forward. So we have basically all new board. 4 out of 5 members are new on the board, so it's exciting times. Just wanted to also mention the social meetings that we have. We meet Sundays at Old Crown at 11 a.m. and Wednesdays at 6 at Matt Anthony's. Those meetings are open to anyone and everyone. So with that, we're going to begin our topic for today. I think we have an interesting topic. We're going to talk about science deniers and how science deniers use science and things like that. So, Caleb was nice enough to put together a good flow for the show. So, Caleb, with that, I'll let you begin the topic.
Awesome. Thanks. So to begin, I'd actually like to start by defining who I'm talking about when I'm talking about science deniers, just so we're clear and everybody's on the same page. So far as I'm concerned, a science denier is any person, any group or entity that denies the legitimacy of the scientific method or their mainstream conclusions. And these people tend to come to these conclusions irrationally. If you're not using science, you're using something else. And you have to be able to show that whatever that something else is superior to science, which has yet to be done. There just simply isn't a mechanism out there that competes with it. So science deniers, they've always been around. There's always been science deniers for as long as science has existed. And I really thought, by the time that I was as old as I am now, that I would see less of this. I really did. And it actually seems to me like it's making a resurgence, something fierce. But anyway, does anyone have an objection to that?
I think that's a pretty good description. Yeah. And then they come in many, science deniers really do come in many shapes, forms, and sizes with different motivations and things like that. So yeah, I completely agree.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I thought it'd be good to also explain exactly what science is and what science is not. But before the show started, V, you said that you actually had a pretty good description.
So I pulled up basically a dictionary and looked up the definition of science. And the dictionary had 2 different definitions, actually. So I'll just read both of them and kind of comment on those. So one of the definitions was a systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. I think that's the more common definition that more people have. The other definition is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That's basically a mouthful, but what it says is that science is an activity. It's dynamic. It's a method of studying the world. That's actually a definition that I prefer. It's active. Science is an active process. It describes. We create hypotheses, theories. We have verification methods. We build on prior work. Based on all that, we predict what's going to happen. And we check, did our prediction meet what we later find? That is basically the scientific method. So I like that description a lot more. But science, in the common sense of the word, is oftentimes used as the first definition. That it is an organized body of knowledge. It's not that it's a bad definition, but I think it's it's very passive. It's very static. It makes it sound like you can't challenge science. But one of the strengths of science is that anyone can make progress. Anyone can. There's no authority in science that is not challengeable.
I like to say that science. I have conversations with people all the time that like to call me. I can't remember how they phrase it. Scientism, I guess. So whatever that would make from the religious perspective, they say that I'm worshiping some form of scientism because I'm a methodological naturalist.
Right.
And I agree, but what I mean to say here is that that's absolutely and completely false, because science doesn't proclaim dogmatic truths, period. End of discussion. They don't claim, science doesn't claim absolute truths.
Right.
Ever. Everything that we know technically is up for dispute. If you can show that it's wrong, then we will accept that. We, being scientists, I'm not a scientist. If you can show a scientist in the scientific community that anything, say, you could disprove the existence of photons, for example. That's something that we all accept that exists, photons. But if you could somehow prove to the scientific community's satisfaction that photons don't exist, then you can do that, and that will become the accepted science.
Yeah, that's actually one of the strengths of science. It's part of the scientific method is that when you make, you examine a bunch of observations, you form a hypothesis and a theory, and you predict what's going to happen. And the reason why we predict what's going to happen is to check our theory, to try to disprove our theory. Our theory has to be falsifiable. If we don't have a falsifiable theory, we don't have a good theory. That's I like to give as an example string theory. The mathematics behind it apparently are beautiful. They work. They describe the world that we see. But unfortunately, just because they're those observations and are compatible with our world, doesn't mean that it's true. We need a method to check it against other competing theories. And right now, the predictions of string theory are so difficult to check that there's no practical test that we can have. We can't prove it or disprove it. And that makes it not really science. I mean, it's scientific because of all the other aspects to it, because of the mathematics that's behind it, because of the method, because it builds on prior science, because of all these other things. But until you verify it, until you're satisfied that your theory is better at describing the world around you than competing theory, it's not really proven. It's still just a hypothesis. It hasn't graduated to theory status, in my opinion, even though the word theory has been used with regards to string theory. So that's just an example of that. And a lot of other aspects of our life don't have that. When you talk about virtually anything else, you don't tell people how to prove you wrong. And scientists in general will tell you, here's my theory, and here's how to prove me wrong. Albert Einstein, when he came up with the theory of relativity, said that it'll take all the experiments in the world to prove the theory right, but it'll only take one to prove it wrong. And he'd given people, the methods by which they could prove him wrong. And that's a strength. That's a real strength. Yeah.
Yeah. You gave a wonderful lecture just then, and I absolutely agree with everything that you said. One example that I can think of that kind of goes along the lines that you were talking about, where this isn't really science, but it sounds scientific, is something called the Banach-Tarski paradox. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, no, I haven't. What is that?
The Banach-Tarski paradox is a mathematical proof, and I'm going to say that again, a mathematical proof that states and shows that if you have a perfect sphere and by simply rearranging the parts, you can create two identical perfect spheres without losing or gaining any mass in each sphere.
Oh.
The problem is you have to delve into the realm of infinities, and it doesn't appear that we live in a universe with actualized infinities, but in principle, if we did, you could create two identical objects by simply rearranging the parts. Have you ever seen that? It was this old meme GIF. That's the word I'm looking for. This GIF that came out back in the day. It was this piece of chocolate, and they would cut off a corner of it and then rearrange the parts. And then when they rearranged them, it would appear as if there was an extra piece of chocolate that just magically came out of nowhere. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, no, I haven't. No.
Okay, yeah, it's that one's an interesting illusion, but it kind of helps give an idea of what I'm talking about here, because it literally what the Banach-Tarski paradox is that applied to a perfect sphere with an infinite number of points in it. And again, it's a mathematical proof. You can mathematically show that this should be possible, but in the real world, chances are it's not. You can't prove it's not, because we don't honestly know if there are an infinite number of points between my left finger and my right finger. We just don't know. But we're pretty sure that there's not. So
I'll throw in something funny that I heard from Lawrence Krauss talking about infinities. He and it was somebody else that came up with the example, but I can't think of. I think it was called the Hilbert's Hotel or something like that. I don't know if you've heard of that. Yeah, and basically it's infinities are weird, and just to kind of give an example of how weird infinities are and how these things arise. Let's say you have an infinitely big hotel. So your hotel has infinite number of rooms, and they're all taken. And let's say an infinitely big family comes in and asks to stay in your hotel. And, they come, they talk to the attendant, and they say, well, we need, rooms for our infinitely big family. But the attendant says, well, I'm sorry, but all the rooms are taken. But I can make an exception for you. I can make this happen. I'll take the person in room 1 and I'll put them in room 2. I'll take the person from room 3 and put them in room 4, and so on. And now all of a sudden you have all the odd number rooms taken and all the even number rooms are unoccupied. But we know that there is infinite number of odd and even number of rooms. So now I have infinite number of rooms that are free, and your infinitely large family can stay in the infinitely large hotel, even though all the rooms of the infinitely large hotel were taken to begin with. So there's paradoxes like that in science. Obviously, they can't apply to the real world, but
Infinities are obviously intriguing to think about. They're very confusing. We don't really have a firm understanding of them, but our understanding of infinities get better all the time. Like, for example, this might sound pretty bizarre. If you add up, for example, every integer, 1 plus 2 plus 3, I think it's every integer. It might be, anyway, I'm pretty sure it's every integer. 1 plus 2 plus 3. No, I apologize. It's 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 8. So whatever that's called, I can't remember. I apologize.
Yeah.
But, I'm sorry. If you add up all those numbers, and in the end, what you're going to find is that they all add up to something that sounds very counterintuitive. You get the number negative 1/12. If you add all those numbers up. 1 plus 2, 8 plus 16 plus 32, and on and on and on. You get something that's very counterintuitive. You get negative 1/12. I can't show you how it's done, but you can ask any mathematician and they'll tell you the same thing. You can honestly just do a quick Google search on this, but this is just kind of one of those things that shows that when you're trying to talk about infinities, you can't use your own preconceived notions and intuitions. You just can't. We're not hardwired to think about infinities. We're hardwired to survive in the savannah.
Yeah. And that's where the scientific method, comes to help us. Because we're not hardwired to think of these weird things. We have structured our way of thinking. We've placed these rigid boundaries around this method, and it has worked for us. It has taken us to uncover what's true or more likely to be true about our world. So let's move on. Let's go to the next kind of on the list is why would someone be a science denier? What makes people deny science? I mean, these are proved, or what we as scientists believe are proved explanations for how the world works. Like, why would people deny that?
Yeah, well, like I was mentioning before, a lot of science is very counterintuitive, which in and of itself is going to make people skeptical, I suppose. No, that's definitely the wrong word. It's going to give people a bad rub if you tell them
right.
that 2 plus 4 plus 8 equates to negative 1/12. And so it's very confusing. A lot of it is. So I think that's obviously a pretty significant factor. I honestly think that the vast majority of science denial has to do with personal beliefs, primarily religion, for example. People don't want to see the evidence for something that's going to disprove a fundamental aspect of their being. Learning that everything that you believed in life could be wrong is a scary notion, and I understand that. And often what you'll find is when you present evidence to people that contradicts their own personal beliefs, you'll get a blowback. They'll actually double down on it. It's this strange phenomenon, but it's very real. We're all susceptible to it. I'm sure we've all done it.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So when you try to tell somebody that the Earth really isn't 6,000 years old, but they fervently believe it, you could take them to the Grand Canyon and ask them to point out any one of those layers that shouldn't belong. You can tell them why everything is the way it is. You can show them physical evidence. You can give them the fossils and put them in their hands, and chances are they're going to double down on their beliefs.
Yeah, I think religion in that sense is even worse than other reasons to be a science denier. Usually religious beliefs are very central to who a person is. So if you attack a religious belief, if you try to prove that some religious belief is wrong, some of those people will feel that they're personally being attacked. You're attacking an idea. Attacking an idea is okay. You don't want to be disrespectful to a person, but when they feel that idea is so central to who they are, they're being personally attacked. That defensive wall that comes up immediately when they hear something challenging one of those preconceived notions or beliefs. That wall is 10 times higher and 10 times stronger when it has a religious source. Fundamentalists that we've seen on TV, debate Bill Nye, the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate. People like Ken Ham, they feel threatened by science. They go to great lengths to try to, disprove science. They still see the benefit of science, so they kind of try to sort of use science, but they'll put it in their own framework, and they've learned how to pull the wool over the eyes of some people, how to mislead them. They've had 2,000 years of practice since Christ supposedly walked this earth, and they're pretty good at it. They've established institutions like the Discovery Institute, Answers in Genesis. That's the Ken Ham thing. We've all heard of Ken Hovind with his Patriot Bible College. So those science deniers are really strong, and they're pushing into schools, into all kinds of areas of our life, and sometimes they have a money motive behind it too. With the that new ark thing that they built down in Kentucky, people pay real money to go there. They had millions of dollars in donations to build that thing.
Yeah, plus if we're going to mention the Ark, I have to mention the Creationist Museum.
Of course, it's right next door, right?
It's both of which were aided financially by the state, both of which were also aided heavily by donations, mostly through donations. And it's kind of surprising to me personally, because I never honestly grew up believing any of these things. I used to grow up, when I was younger and growing up, I did believe that God had created the earth, but I had been taught before that notion, really, that the earth was already old. I wasn't taught the notion that God created the earth until well into elementary school, after I had already started learning about dinosaurs and things like this. So these are things that I never really truly believed in the first place. So it's really, I don't understand how people can so fervently believe these things when there's really no evidence to back it up.
And let's just mention that not all religious people deny science. For example, this is one aspect where actually Catholics are pretty good at it. They accept most of science hook, line, and sinker. Buddhists
want to say something to that point right there.
Okay.
The Pope has officially decreed that it's okay to believe in evolution, but that it's not mandated. You can go either way. And I don't know about all Catholics, but as far as the Catholics that I personally know and that I personally talk to, of which there are quite a few, I'm actually pretty active in Catholic chat forums and such.
Okay.
I'm trying to learn as much as I can about Catholicism. Most of the Catholics that I've come across are actually fervent evolution deniers, global warming deniers. Wow. Many of them, obviously all of them are anti-abortion. They're very pro-life there. And a lot of them, I don't want to say most, because I don't usually talk about global warming with them, but whenever it's come up, most of them that I've talked to also tend to deny climate change. Now, again, I don't want to generalize. This is just the ones that I'm personally in contact with. But from what my own anecdotal experience, I actually get the opposite feeling from what you just said.
I think you're right. I think you're right that you're going to find a lot of that. But it's not. I meant it more of it's not a teaching of the church to deny all that. Where if you go to a Ken Ham thing, he's going to push really hard for it. He's going to shove it down your throat that the Earth is 6,000 years old. You must believe this. You don't have a choice not to believe it. And, anytime that the science that is in front of you conflicts with my religious book, you must, distrust the science, So at least in that sense, they're better. They don't deny it as a central teaching of their doctrine.
Yeah, like you were mentioning, being religious isn't even necessarily a factor here. It's a heavy factor generally. I know
Yeah.
I normally don't like to generalize, but generally it is a pretty significant factor for science deniers. But quite frankly, a lot of it also boils down to a misunderstanding of science. I myself have been victim to this very recently in the past. I was adamant that we almost certainly knew, for example, that string theory was going to be the answer.
Right.
That we had these 11 dimensions and that we can show that there are actually 11 dimensions, even if not experimentally. And so I was adamant. I really thought that we had the answers there. And whenever I was in conversation, I would say that. I would say, look, we have the answers right here. It makes not perfect sense, but it makes a lot of sense. Right. And I would actually be spreading this information. I was telling these people that they should believe this stuff, when in actuality there is absolutely not one iota of physical evidence to support anything that string theory has. And so I've actually kind of stepped back on my fervency there. I'm now of the opinion that it's possible that they have an idea of what's going on, but I'm actually losing a lot of my confidence, almost all of my confidence, quite frankly, in string theory.
Yeah. And that's where healthy skepticism comes into being in science, reading, trying to understand what they're telling you, trying to understand, how far testing has been done, trying to understand that just because something looks good on paper doesn't mean that it's going to pan out. Too often we hear on TV, for example, about what people know, like antioxidants. They were the latest and greatest thing. And now all of a sudden, well, maybe, we should take it easy on the antioxidants. Maybe they're not this panacea that cures everything. And
the logic, though, right? Because when somebody tells you that oxygen kills you, which it technically over time, that's one of the things that kills us, gives you cancer and all.
Right.
It makes sense to think, oh, well, we have evidence that says oxygen can kill you, and if you deoxidize, it's pretty good for you. And so there's actual evidence for that. But you have to follow that to its conclusion. Its conclusion is, if you take too many antioxidants, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah. So it's not so clear cut in so many cases. These things, especially with the diets and stuff, even though they sound scientific, so often run in fads, and after a few years they're disproven and new things come up. But those things are not as hard of a science as like physics is. There's rarely a concrete formula that applies to everything. But one thing that I was going to mention, since we are talking about why people distrust science, sometimes it's because of, you look at nuclear disasters, you look at oil spills, you look at terrible weapons, like you read about World War I and chemical warfare. You look at all these things, weapons of mass destruction, these are all products of science. This is the dark side of science. And I can see how some people would see those things and they would want to stay away from it. They would rather maybe not know about these things. Maybe they're afraid that the government is going to conduct some experiment on them without their knowledge. Maybe they'll experiment on them with some kind of chemicals. And we see that with people that believe in chemtrails. They think that the airplanes, when they leave the white streaks in the sky, it's not just water vapor and exhaust fumes. They think it's, something that the airplanes are spraying on us. So it may be illogical, but to me, at least, it's illogical. But I can see how someone would believe that. And it's very easy to go on the internet and find proof for any belief that you may have. Somebody somewhere has written about something that may be totally untrue, but if you believe it, somebody else probably believes it, and you can go on there and find it, and now we have a little echo chamber, and we reinforce our beliefs, and that's how these things spread. It's very easy to do on the internet these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was a kid, right when they were going to be firing up the Large Hadron Collider, my parents, along with many other Christians around the nation and around the world, were extremely concerned that the Large Hadron Collider was going to end the world. They thought that they were going to create micro black holes when these particles
right,
and that they were going to suck the whole Earth in, and we were all going to die. And these fears were perpetuated essentially by propaganda.
Oh yeah,
because there really was absolutely no concern. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there was one offshoot scientist somewhere that wrote a paper that said, "Hey, it's possible that this could happen."
Yeah.
And how people who want to reinforce their own beliefs that science could be dangerous, they'll take that little tidbit and explode it, make it huge.
Oh yeah.
And I remember when that happened. I remember my stepdad Jack walking up to me saying, "You know what, son? Pretty sure the world's going to be ending in a month. They're going to turn this thing on and we're all going to die." And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, A, I don't think we're going to die. And B, if we were, why would you tell me this? Just so blunt. So, all he did was just say that and walk away. And I was kind of just in shock and awe that he would bother even mentioning that. Sorry, a little personal anecdote there.
No. I mean, it goes towards the distrust of science. A lot of people out there think that scientists would do anything without regard for human life, suffering, any of that. I mean, if there was ever a realistic chance, nobody would ever turn on that machine. Nobody. And here's, just so people out there know, okay, there is no chance that the Large Hadron Collider is going to create a micro black hole, okay? Rest assured, the energies that they can reach are not sufficient. Oftentimes, we have particles that are emitted from the sun, and they bombard our atmosphere. The energy of the collisions, as a result of that, are much higher than what the Large Hadron Collider could ever achieve. So we have, a billion Large Hadron Colliders basically hitting us every single day in the upper atmosphere, and the Earth is still here, and it's probably going to be here for a couple more billion years. We're not going to get sucked into anything. Oh, man.
Yeah, and another thing that I briefly wanted to touch on before we moved on was this. It's part of our nature. We tend to favor any theory, even if it's a conspiracy theory, to no theory at all. So there are certain things that explain something that they might have a question for.
Right.
And if you ask a scientist, they'll tell you the same thing on that issue. I'm not sure, but it might be this, or it might be this. And whichever one that they think is most likely going to adhere to their own beliefs is the one they're going to latch onto, and they're going to confirm it through their own confirmation bias. And so what you get here is essentially how pseudoscience, this is kind of where pseudoscience is birthed. You can take that and run with it. And these pseudosciences can seem preferable to actual science because it reinforces your own belief. One example that I can think of is I used to be a ghost hunter. I used to travel the tri-state area, and I was the EVP specialist. That was my duty. I loved it. I legitimately thought that we were taking scientific equipment to these people's houses or to these abandoned buildings, and we're legitimately collecting data that supports the notion that a supernatural realm exists. The problem is if this was actually legitimate scientific data, we would have had this figured out a long time ago. The methods that we were using were things like using EMF detectors, infrared, night vision. There's somebody at one point rented this really expensive UV camera, which allegedly was able to see into the ultraviolet range and all the different recording equipment. And it seemed like we were getting consistent findings, because we'd go one place and the same things would happen. We'd go another place and those things wouldn't happen, but we'd go back to the old place and they would happen again. Or you'd go somewhere else and you'd get very similar findings. But everything that we were collecting was inconclusive, and it was subjective to that environment only. And everything that we were using, our equipment was either too sensitive or not sensitive enough, or was just there was interference, essentially. Any electronic device can interfere with that equipment, and it does frequently. The equipment in and of itself, like for example, I was an EVP specialist. We use digital recorders, and it's not uncommon to just have random noise that just randomly comes on. It happens, and sometimes there's a process called. Sorry, I can't remember what it's called. The name escapes me, but it's this tendency that people have to hear and see things that they want to see, especially if they think it's a person. So you hear something in the white noise and it sounds like a voice, and then you kind of make out in your head what that voice might be saying. Or you see a picture and it might look like a person, and the more you want it to look like a person, the more it's going to look like a person. So these tend to feed into your own confirmation biases. But when you put all of that data together, it equates to nothing, because the data is so easily corrupted. The data isn't reliable. You can't repeat these experiments. And that's really the most important part. These experiments that you're running cannot be repeated consistently. And if you can't do it consistently, if I can't do it here, and you can't do it consistently, then it's just not science. It's guesswork.
Yes. And, kind of what you were saying, that it's people are uncomfortable not knowing. When you ask someone a question and the answer is I don't know, that's not a satisfying answer. And oftentimes, let's say you go and you ask a scientist a question, and here's this very simple example. When you don't understand what's behind your question, you may think it's a simple question, a simple answer, but oftentimes it's not. Like my girlfriend asked me, hey, should I change my oil? So I had to go through the whole thing. When was the last time you changed your oil? How many miles have you driven? Were you mostly on the highway or mostly in the city? What kind of oil did you put in your car? What's your oil level? I had to ask like 5, 6, 7, 8 questions to be able to tell her, hey, yes, go and change your oil, or no, wait for me to come on the weekend and I can change it for you because it's going to be cheaper. Now, and that's a simple question about changing someone's oil. Now, imagine if you ask a question that is, hey, how does gravity work? And, maybe somebody expects an answer that is maybe 2 or 3 sentences long, but, the scientist would go in and start explaining, well, it depends on what you mean. Do you mean on the quantum scale? Do you mean on the large scale? Are you asking me if we have figured out a way to explain gravity on the quantum level? We thought it was just a force between 2 massive objects, but now we know it's a curvature of space. But now on long distances, we figured out that maybe it doesn't quite work. Maybe it does. Maybe we got to add some dark matter in there, and you start confusing it, and it's just insane. And then, you got this flat earther guy that comes along and says, oh, I got the answer for you. Well, here's how gravity works. And he explains it to you with 2 sentences. And you're like, oh, well, I can actually understand this. It's simpler. And you can memorize it and you can understand it, and now you have an explanation. Where before, the explanation you would have gotten from a scientist may have confused you 10 times more than you were even, confused before. So a lot of times, these pseudoscientists or people that push these fake sciences give you a very comfortable answer that's easy to understand, memorize, and you walk away from the conversation satisfied. And that's powerful. That is very powerful. And it works. It works.
And I have to admit, I am extremely susceptible to this myself, and I've had to over the years learn to fight that urge to just accept a simple answer, because I have this craving for knowledge. I really want to know as much as I possibly can before I'm gone. I feel like I've never learned enough, and I never will, and I want to keep it that way. But I'm also really driven to have an answer for these questions. I've had many arguments, many discussions, heated even, on the nature of gravity, like you were just talking about.
Sure.
I mean, it's hard to get yourself to be skeptical of your own beliefs, and that's really what is missing from these science deniers. They refuse, as far as I'm concerned, to really critically analyze their own belief system. Why do they believe what they believe? And they don't want to ask themselves that question.
Yeah, one thing to understand is, like you were saying, you're maybe a little more susceptible to falling for something that's not true, but that's okay. It's okay to be wrong as long as you recognize that you could be wrong, and as long as you're open to new things and to exploring, new evidence and new conclusions. It's okay. We've all been wrong. I've been wrong on things. Everybody has been wrong on things. And it's not a big deal as long as we're not dogmatic, as long as we don't, we don't close ourselves from new information. But okay, I think that about sums why and how people become distrustful of science. Why do they deny it? That kind of stuff. So let's move on to what's the potential for harm. So what's wrong when somebody doesn't understand some science, and what's wrong with that?
Well, personally, for me, the first thing that I think about when I think about what the potential for harm is here, my mind immediately goes right to my son. I worry for him, mostly. I think about the parents that teach their children that the earth really is only 6,000 years old, and that God did it, or that the earth is flat, which is pretty rare, or that any of these things. If they're teaching them fundamental facts of reality that are just false, this is going to affect their lives. I mean, what are the odds that some child that's brought up in this home and fervently believes this and well into his teens, even in his early 20s, is going to be a successful scientist or a successful engineer or politician? Politician, kind of another story, I guess. I guess you can go miles denying science and politics these days, but well, there you go. That's another harm right there. Is politicians are pushing for, not pushing, rather. There are politicians that are openly denying science, such as global warming, which is probably the most detrimental thing that is happening right now in politics for this planet. But bar none, the simple fact that there are this many Republican Party members, that representatives, whatever they are, governors, senators, presidents, that are denying global warming by either calling it a hoax or just outright denying its legitimacy whatsoever, are putting our planet at risk, are putting my children at risk, and your children, and so on and so forth. And they're creating an environment, a nation, where ignorance is heralded. When you can deny evolution in schools, in public schools, to push, rather, for the denial of evolution, to teach, quote unquote, the controversy, or to teach the quote unquote controversy of global warming. This is going to have a detrimental effect on society, on culture. It's going to have a detrimental effect on really even the economy. I mean, if we're not producing scientists and engineers that are capable of innovating, we're not going to have anything to really export. I mean, we are a nation of innovators. We create pretty much the vast majority of the technology that pushes us forward into the future. And if we're going to create a future where it's okay, excuse me, where it's okay to be ignorant, where it's acceptable to believe certain science, your science, quote unquote, your science, as opposed to mainstream science. I mean, it's just gonna create problems. I'm sorry, I'm gonna rant on if I keep going.
No, I was just gonna say, you brought up creationism and some things like that, I think, and I have a map over here that's from Slate.com, and it kind of shows where it's okay. It's a color coded map, and it shows in what states is okay to teach creationism. So, for example, they have a dot for every school that teaches creationism, and there are different colors of dots depending on how the school is funded. So, for example, in Tennessee and in Louisiana, I mean, the entire state is covered in dots, and they're all green dots. And what the green dots mean is that there are public schools in states where law permits creationist instruction. So Tennessee, Louisiana permit creationist instruction outright, basically. Then there's orange dots, which you can see some, here and there in Indiana, Ohio, Florida, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, but they're few and far between. And what the orange dots means is private schools that teach creationism and accept tax-funded vouchers or scholarships. And then there are some red dots, and I think you see those in Arkansas and Texas only. And what those are is something called Responsive Ed Charter School using creationist curricula. I'm not entirely certain what Responsive Ed Charter means, but there's a lot of states that permit various pseudosciences like creationism and stuff like that to be taught in our schools, and it's dangerous. It's one of the bigger pseudosciences out there, and it's tax funded. It's often in some cases at least it's funded by your and my tax dollars. And another thing that I was going to throw out there was, I believe it was in South Dakota, they recently had this bill that would basically allow scientists to teach like alternate theories in their classroom. And that of course means teaching creationism. The creationists have been finding more and more creative ways by which to sue various schools, and and various ways to sneak in their creationist agenda. And I believe that bill has passed.
I honestly, I obviously I think I'm wrong here, but I thought it was already federally mandated that creationism should not be taught in public schools.
Not necessarily. See, that's the thing that they play. They don't outright teach creationism. They find ways to skirt the laws. It's like, oh, well, it's okay in private schools, or it's okay in this charter school, or the creationists basically are relentless. They've been going at it, and they've achieved some success here and there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew that in a private school you could teach whatever you wanted, but I'm just shocked, really, that you're saying, I'm not looking at the chart that you're looking at, but you're saying you're seeing all these dots where this is essentially being taught. I don't even know if I should be using the word essentially, but whether it is or whether it's essentially being taught in schools, is just shocking to me that it really is. I mean, this.
Yeah. Well, but this is what's happening with some of the proposed laws out there, and we already have that in Indiana, where let's say you want to sign up your kid in a private school, because that kid doesn't go to a public school. They can get a voucher for the money that would have normally went into the public school, and take that voucher and take it to the private school. Now, we can't tell the private school what to teach or not to teach, but so we end up funneling state dollars into private schools, and those private schools can teach whatever they want. So that's one way that they go around that. It's not direct, and sometimes it may be, like some of the things that creationists have tried to do is just sneak in one sentence into that's mandated, but it's like this little seed of doubt that they want to plant into kids' minds that they can later explore and have it grow into something bigger. Because again, it's an easier thing to understand. Creationism is very easy to understand. Hey, the creator made it this way. Done deal. It's super easy. It's not confusing. You don't have to figure out, what was the selective pressure for this this trait to evolve. How did this wing form? Was half a wing at some point there or not? It's a lot. Evolution is a lot more difficult.
And that, plus there are some minor similarities which they want to twist to make it seem as if the science that we have basically proves what they have. What I'm getting at here is, how the Bible says that they will reproduce after their kind, right?
Right.
It sounds like evolution. So when we actually discover this, some 2000, maybe 4,000, I don't know when that line was written. I don't know if that's Old or New Testament, but so thousands of years later, we confirm, I'm going to use that word, confirm that evolution is a factor in reality.
Yeah.
And they look at evolution and say, oh, okay, I get it. I mean, it's so close. Evolutionists have it so close, as long as they would just say after their kind, because my book says after their kind.
Right.
They're so close. They're almost there. And, this kind of goes along with that that story. It's like this joke that you'll hear where the scientists take, 1,000 years to climb to the top of this mountain. And when they get there, there are a bunch of theists already waiting for them.
Oh, that's a bunch of baloney.
Yeah. And, that's the kind of mentality that I'm talking about here. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But I think we're coming up on the last 10 minutes of our show. So let's sort of focus a little bit here, because I think we're going in so many different directions. One thing that I wanted to mention, since we're still talking about potential for harm, what's the potential for harm from these things? And you mentioned your kids, and that's so important. When people deny global warming, what they're denying is something that 97% of scientists that are in the field agree that is happening and is human caused, and the potential damages that can happen to the planet are immense. You got to imagine low-lying areas like Florida, 2/3 underwater. Imagine countries like Bangladesh that are so poor that they haven't contributed at all to global warming, but they'll be underwater. More than half of Bangladesh is only a couple of feet above water. There's island nations that, you mentioned earlier, that they have to pump water out so their island doesn't get sunk.
Yeah, they're doing parts of Florida even. It's happening
Sure.
Here. So if somebody wants to deny it, go to Florida. I couldn't tell you exactly where right now, but just go to Florida, Google it, and you'll see that they're pumping the ocean water back into the ocean because the oceans are rising. There's evidence that you can see with your own eyes here in the States that prove this is a phenomenon that's happening.
Yeah, and we have glaciers melting. These glaciers have been around for tens of thousands of years, and a lot of glaciers have disappeared just in a matter of a couple of decades. And a lot of those glaciers, they supply water for people that live there. So without the glacier, these people don't have water. So this stuff has real consequences today, even with just, 1 degree that our average temperature has increased so far, and there's already very, very real consequences. We have the potential for droughts, for floods, for all kinds of things, and these are awful. And that will start mass migration that is unstoppable and unlike anything we've ever seen. It's there's a lot of consequences to that.
Yeah, and one of the things that that's difficult to talk about in conversation, colloquially, especially when you're just talking with friends and family, because of politics. That's what I'm getting at here. It's made its way. This problem, the science deniers, people who want to deny evolution, climate change, all these, it's made its way into politics now. And it's made its way all the way to the very tippy top. Donald Trump himself is on record saying that climate change is a hoax. He doesn't just say that he doesn't believe that climate change is a real phenomenon. He goes so far as to say it's a hoax, which to me is a step above and beyond. And then he goes to nominate Scott Pruitt, I think his name is, as the administrator of the EPA. And he's a climate change denier.
Yeah.
And even if, it just blows my mind, because even if I, as the president of the United States, didn't think that it was a real thing, I would at least operate under the assumption that it's a possibility. And if it's a possibility that climate change is a human-caused phenomenon, then you should treat it as such. You should at least assume. Like, what's the harm in assuming that that's the case? I mean, worst case scenario, you're still going to create a better environment for everybody.
But some people are going to lose a lot of money. The big oil industry. Those guys are going to lose money, and they have a lot of sway. But just to kind of move the conversation along, because we only have about 2 minutes left in the show. We've discussed that. Those things are terrible. The consequences are real, and there's political interests involved. There's money interests involved. And we've only touched on global warming. I mean, there's other things. There's anti-vaxxers that potentially endanger kids. All that kind of stuff.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.